December 19th, 1944. The Balkans. In a freezing supply depot outside Sofia, Bulgarian quartermaster officers stood in stunned silence, staring at rows upon rows of captured Allied boots. The leather was thick, the insulation generous, the craftsmanship impeccable. Behind them, through the depot's open doors, they could see their own soldiers limping past, feet wrapped in rags, some missing toes to frostbite. They had believed their German allies were providing them with the best equipment modern warfare could offer. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these Bulgarian officers were witnessing was not just a difference in boot quality. It was the physical manifestation of their nation's place in a conflict that had already decided their fate. A revelation that would transform loyal allies into desperate defectors, and a lesson in how industrial capacity could defeat ideology one frozen foot at a time. Captain Georgi Dimitrov had served in the Bulgarian Third Army for 3 years by the time he saw his first pair of American boots. He was 32 years old, a career officer who had genuinely believed that alignment with Germany during the war represented Bulgaria's best chance at reclaiming lost territories and securing its future. His own boots, issued in 1942, had been resoled twice with whatever materials the supply corps could scavenge. The soles were now a patchwork of leather scraps, rubber from old tires, and in some places, hardened cardboard that dissolved in the snow. The winter of 1944 was particularly brutal in the Balkans. Temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero in the mountains where Bulgarian units were stationed. Dimitrov kept meticulous records in his diary, and his entries from that December tell a story that official military reports deliberately obscured. On December 5th, he wrote that 14 men in his company were unable to march due to frostbite. By December 10th, that number had risen to 37. 2 soldiers had lost all feeling in their feet and had to be carried on makeshift stretchers. Meanwhile, German supply officers continued to assure Bulgarian commanders that new equipment was coming. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Weber, the German liaison attached to the Bulgarian Third Army, had repeated this promise so many times that even he seemed to have stopped believing it. Weber was 45, a logistics officer who had spent the first 2 years of the conflict in France and who understood better than most that Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. But orders were orders, and his job was to maintain the alliance, even as it crumbled from within. The capture of the Allied supply convoy happened almost by accident. On December 15th, a Bulgarian patrol intercepted an American transport column that had gotten separated from its main force during an operation in Yugoslavia. The engagement lasted less than an hour. The American drivers, vastly outnumbered and unable to call for support, surrendered without much resistance. Inside the trucks were supplies meant for partisan forces, medical equipment, ammunition, rations, and 600 pairs of winter boots. When the convoy reached the depot in Sofia, Dimitrov was among the first officers called to inspect the contents. He had expected to find supplies he could distribute to his freezing men. What he found instead was an education in the vast chasm between Allied and Axis industrial capability. The boots were made by the International Shoe Company, contract number W875-QM-43. Each pair consisted of full-grain leather outers, wool felt insulation rated for temperatures down to 40 degrees below zero, rubber soles with deep treads, reinforced eyelets, and waterproof treatment that actually worked. The craftsmanship was so superior to anything Dimitrov had seen in Bulgarian or German stores that his first instinct was to check if they were officers' boots somehow mixed in with enlisted equipment. They were not. These were standard issue for American infantrymen. Every single one of the millions of American soldiers got boots like these, not just officers, not just elite units. Everyone. Dimitrov picked up one of the American boots and held it next to his own. The comparison was almost comical. His boot weighed perhaps half as much, not because it was efficiently designed, but because there simply was not enough material in it. The sole was thin enough that he could feel every pebble through it when he walked, The stitching was already failing in several places. There was no real insulation, just a thin cotton lining that had long ago compressed into uselessness. Then Sergeant Major Ivan Petrov, Dimitrov's senior enlisted man, pointed out something that made the situation even more sobering. Among the captured supplies were production manifests and inventory sheets. Petrov, who had worked as an accountant before the conflict, began reading through them with increasing disbelief. The manifests indicated that these 600 pairs of boots represented approximately 0.00015% of American monthly production. The factory that made them, just one of 78 contracted manufacturers, produced 40,000 pairs per month. And boots were such a minor concern in the American supply system that the paperwork listed them in the same category as socks and underwear, disposable items that could be replaced without even filling out special requisition forms. Dimitrov did the mathematics in his head. If one American factory produced 40,000 pairs monthly, and there were 78 such factories, that meant America was producing over 3 million pairs of winter boots every month. Bulgaria's entire annual production of military footwear, including summer boots, dress shoes, and everything else, was perhaps 50,000 pairs. The United States was making in one day what Bulgaria made in half a year, but the revelation went deeper than mere numbers. As Dimitrov and his officers examined the captured supplies more carefully, they began to understand that the boots were just one small piece of a much larger picture. The medical supplies included sulfur drugs that Bulgarian hospitals could not obtain at any price. The rations came in waxed cardboard boxes that were themselves better made than the wooden crates Bulgaria used for ammunition. Even the trucks that had carried the supplies were superior to anything in Bulgarian service, with powerful engines, sophisticated suspension systems, and enough spare parts packed in toolboxes that American drivers could perform major repairs in the field. One item in particular caught everyone's attention. Among the personal effects of the captured American drivers was a small booklet, water-stained and worn, titled A Pocket Guide to Bulgaria. It was produced by the United States War Department specifically for American servicemen who might find themselves operating in Bulgarian territory. The guide was 48 pages long, included a basic Bulgarian phrasebook, cultural notes, and even sketches of Bulgarian landmarks. The fact that America had devoted resources to printing guides for a country that was at best a tertiary theater of operations said something profound about their depth of preparation. Bulgaria had been fighting alongside Germany for 3 years and had never produced equivalent guides for its soldiers serving in occupied territories. American planners, meanwhile, had anticipated every possible scenario thoroughly enough to print guides for countries they might not even fight in, just in case. That evening, Dimitrov was summoned to a meeting with General Konstantin Lukyanov, commander of the Third Army. Also present were several other senior Bulgarian officers and Lieutenant Colonel Weber, the German liaison. The atmosphere in the room was tense. General Lukyanov was 58 years old, a veteran of the Balkan conflicts of 1912 and 1913, who had spent his entire adult life in military service. He was not a man given to panic or rash decisions, but as he looked at the intelligence reports compiled from the captured supplies, his expression was grave. The general spoke carefully, aware that Weber was in the room. He acknowledged that the captured equipment was of high quality. He noted that it would be distributed to Bulgarian troops who needed it most. But then he asked the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice in front of their German ally. If this was standard American equipment, and if production numbers were even remotely close to what the manifest suggested, how could Germany possibly win? Weber's response was a masterpiece of evasion. He talked about secret weapons being developed. He mentioned that American production, while impressive, was spread across multiple theaters and could not all be brought to bear in Europe. He reminded everyone that Soviet equipment was crude and inferior, that British industry was exhausted, that German technical superiority would prevail. But his words rang hollow even to himself. The American boots sitting in the depot were not theoretical. They were real, tangible proof that the Axis was being buried under an avalanche of Allied industrial output. Over the next week, as word spread through the Bulgarian army about the captured supplies, something began to shift in the collective consciousness of the officer corps. Soldiers who received the American boots reported back to their units. The contrast with their previous footwear was so stark that it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Germany was adequately supplying its allies. Private Dimitar Yordanov, a conscript from a small village outside Plovdiv, wrote to his wife after receiving a pair of the American boots. His letter was intercepted by military censors, and a copy ended up in Dimitrov's files. Yordanov described putting on the boots for the first time as a revelation. For the first time in months, his feet were warm. He could march for hours without pain. The frostbite that had been creeping up his toes began to heal. He wrote that if America could make boots this good for every single soldier, then surely the war was already lost. The censors forwarded the letter to intelligence officers, concerned about defeatism spreading through the ranks. But the officers who read it recognized that Yordanov was not expressing defeatism so much as realism. The evidence was literally on his feet. The impact of the boots extended beyond mere physical comfort. In the weeks following their distribution, Bulgarian medical officers documented a dramatic decrease in frostbite cases. Dr. Emil Stoyanov, chief medical officer for the Third Army, compiled a detailed report comparing injury rates before and after the American boots were issued. The statistics were remarkable. Cold weather injuries dropped by 78% in units that received the boots. Soldiers who had been on the verge of medical discharge due to foot problems showed rapid improvement. Men who had been unable to march more than a few kilometers could suddenly complete full-day operations without complaint. But the medical improvements, as significant as they were, paled in comparison to the psychological transformation. Sergeant Major Petrov, who had spent months trying to maintain morale among men whose feet were literally freezing, noticed an immediate change in unit cohesion. Soldiers who received the American boots began to trust that someone somewhere actually cared about their well-being. It was not their own government or their German allies who had provided this care, which created a cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Private Stefan Georgiev, a 23-year-old from Varna, had a particularly revealing reaction. Before receiving the American boots, he had been a model soldier, never questioning orders, always maintaining his equipment as best he could with limited resources. But after wearing the American boots for just 3 days, he began asking dangerous questions. If the Americans could make boots this good for every soldier, he wondered aloud to his squad mates, what else were they capable of? If their enemies were this well supplied, how could Bulgaria possibly be on the winning side? His squad leader, Corporal Vasil Ivanov, tried to redirect the conversation. He reminded Georgiev that equipment was not everything, that German technical innovation and tactical superiority would prevail. But even Ivanov did not sound convinced. He himself was wearing American boots, feeling warmth in his feet for the first time in months, and the physical evidence contradicted everything he was trying to argue. By late December, Bulgarian military intelligence had compiled a comprehensive report on American industrial capacity based not just on the captured supplies, but on information gathered from multiple sources over the previous year. The picture it painted was overwhelming. American aircraft production exceeded 100,000 units annually. American tank production was approaching 50,000 per year. American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than German forces could sink them, and these numbers did not even account for British, Canadian, and Soviet production. The combined Allied industrial capacity was not merely greater than the Axis. It was greater by an order of magnitude so vast that no amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could overcome it. The report included a particularly devastating analysis of logistics. It noted that American soldiers in Europe consumed approximately 67 pounds of supplies per day. This included food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. German soldiers, by contrast, were subsisting on less than 10 pounds per day, and Bulgarian soldiers were getting perhaps 5. The difference was not just in efficiency or planning. It was in the fundamental capacity to produce and transport supplies. The logistics analysis went deeper. Intelligence officers calculated that to match American supply levels, Bulgaria would need to increase its industrial output by approximately 1,300%. Even if every factory in the country converted to military production, even if every worker labored around the clock, It would take years to build the necessary infrastructure. And by that time, the conflict would long since be decided. Major Nikolai Todorov, the lead intelligence analyst on the project, included a section in his report that many considered too pessimistic to share widely. He analyzed not just current production, but projected trajectories. American industrial capacity was still accelerating. New factories were coming online every month. Training programs were producing skilled workers faster than casualties could deplete them. The American economy, unlike those of the Axis powers, was not being strained by the conflict. It was actually growing, becoming more efficient, building momentum that would continue long after peace was declared. Todorov's most chilling observation was about sustainability. He noted that Germany and its allies were consuming resources faster than they could be replaced. Every tank destroyed, every aircraft shot down, every ship sunk represented an irreplaceable loss. The Allies, meanwhile, were replacing losses faster than they occurred. American shipyards were launching cargo vessels at a rate that exceeded losses by a factor of 3 to 1. For every Allied aircraft that went down, 2 more rolled off assembly lines. The mathematical reality was inescapable. This was not a conflict that could be won through heroism or strategy. It was a race of industrial capacity, and the Axis had already lost. The report was classified immediately upon completion. Senior Bulgarian military officials feared that if the full scope of Allied industrial superiority became widely known, it would completely collapse military morale. But copies circulated anyway, passed hand to hand among officers who needed to understand the true strategic situation. Captain Dimitrov received his copy in early January 1945, and reading it, confirmed everything the American boots had already taught him. What made the situation even more dire was that these were not peak Allied numbers. Intelligence analysts estimated that American production was still ramping up, that factories were still being built, that the full weight of American industrial might would not be felt until 1945 or later. Germany, meanwhile, was already at maximum capacity and starting to decline as Allied bombing took its toll. Captain Dimitrov spent New Year's Eve 1944 writing in his diary. His entry from that night survives in Bulgarian military archives. He reflected on how his understanding of the conflict had fundamentally changed over the past 2 weeks. He had entered the military believing that determination and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The American boots had taught him otherwise. He wrote about seeing his men march in formation, wearing their new American boots, moving with an ease and confidence they had not shown in months. He noted the bitter irony that captured enemy equipment was doing more for Bulgarian morale than anything their supposed allies had provided, and he concluded with a thought that would have been dangerous to express publicly, but that he felt compelled to record. Perhaps Bulgaria had chosen the wrong side. Dimitrov was not alone in this realization. Throughout the Bulgarian officer corps, similar conversations were happening in quiet corners, in coded language, always careful to avoid German observers. The question was not whether Germany would lose. The captured boots and the intelligence they represented made that outcome clear. The question was how Bulgaria could extract itself from the alliance before the inevitable collapse dragged them down as well. The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. On January 5, 1945, Soviet forces launched a major offensive into Bulgaria. The Bulgarian government, recognizing that continued resistance was futile, had already been conducting secret negotiations with the Allies. Within weeks, Bulgaria would officially switch sides, declaring opposition to Germany and joining the Allied cause. The transition was not smooth. German forces in Bulgaria fought bitter rearguard actions. Bulgarian units that had fought alongside Germany for years suddenly found themselves turning their weapons against their former allies. The psychological whiplash was severe. But for men like Captain Dimitrov, who had seen the American boots and understood what they represented, the decision made strategic sense, even if it felt morally complicated. The first days after the transition were chaotic. Bulgarian commanders had to quickly reorganize their forces, establish new communication protocols with Allied counterparts, and somehow explain to their troops why yesterday's allies were today's enemies. Some German officers felt personally betrayed by Bulgarian colleagues they had worked with for years. Lieutenant Colonel Weber, the German liaison who had spent months assuring Bulgarian commanders that adequate supplies were coming, was interned along with other German personnel. His last conversation with Dimitrov was brief and painful. Weber accused the Bulgarians of opportunism and cowardice. Dimitrov simply gestured to his men's feet, to the American boots that had revealed the truth about Allied industrial might. Weber had no response. For ordinary Bulgarian soldiers, the transition meant grappling with complex emotions. Many had genuinely believed in the cause they had been fighting for. Others had simply been following orders, not particularly invested in ideology, but committed to their duty. Now they had to reconsider everything. Private Yordanov, who had written so eloquently about the American boots to his wife, found himself questioning whether his 3 years of service had been wasted. He had lost friends in the conflict. He had suffered through terrible conditions. And for what? To be on the losing side of a war that had been decided by factory production numbers. But as Bulgarian units began receiving regular Allied supply shipments, the doubts started to fade. The sheer abundance of supplies was staggering. Food rations that included meat, real coffee, chocolate, and fresh bread. Medical supplies that could actually treat injuries and illnesses. Ammunition in quantities that allowed for proper training rather than hoarding every round. And yes, more boots. Endless supplies of boots in every size, with replacement pairs available whenever needed. Staff Sergeant Petrov, who had managed supply distribution for his company, found himself overwhelmed by the logistical abundance. In 3 years of service alongside Germany, he had become accustomed to shortages, to carefully rationing every resource, to making desperate choices about which needs were most critical. Now, suddenly, there was enough of everything. When he requisitioned medical supplies for his company, he received not just what he asked for, but additional items he had not even known to request. When boots wore out, replacements arrived within days rather than months. The contrast was so stark it seemed almost surreal. In February 1945, now fighting on the Allied side, Dimitrov's unit participated in operations to clear German forces from Yugoslav territory. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. He was wearing Bulgarian insignia, but American boots, fighting against an ally he had once believed in, alongside forces he had been trained to consider enemies. During a lull in operations, Dimitrov encountered an American liaison officer, Captain James Morrison from Ohio. Morrison was 26 years old, fresh-faced, and possessed of the casual confidence that came from knowing his nation's industrial capacity could manufacture victory. Through a translator, the two men talked about the conflict, about their respective roles, about what would happen when it was all over. Dimitrov asked Morrison if American soldiers knew how good they had it. Did they understand that their boots alone were better than most Bulgarian soldiers' entire kit? Morrison admitted that most American troops took their equipment for granted. They complained about the weight of their packs, the quality of their rations, the discomfort of military life. They had no frame of reference for what it meant to fight with inadequate supplies because they had never experienced it. Then Morrison said something that stuck with Dimitrov for the rest of his life. He said that America's greatest weapon was not any particular technology or tactical doctrine. It was the simple fact that American industry could outproduce any opponent so thoroughly that victory became inevitable through sheer overwhelming material superiority. Soldiers might win or lose individual engagements, but wars were won in factories, and America had more factories than anyone else. Morrison elaborated on this theme, explaining concepts that were common knowledge to American officers, but revelatory to someone like Dimitrov, who had spent years working within systems of chronic scarcity. He described how American logistics worked, how supply chains functioned with almost mechanical efficiency, how entire industries had been converted to military production with stunning speed. He mentioned that American automobile factories had stopped making cars entirely and were now producing tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles at rates that seemed impossible to comprehend. The American officer pulled out a small notebook and sketched some rough figures. He explained that American factories operated on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had perfected assembly line techniques that Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier and applied them to military production on a scale never before attempted. A single factory complex in Detroit, Morrison said, could produce more military vehicles in a month than all of Italy's factories combined produced in a year. Dimitrov asked how American workers maintained such productivity. Morrison's answer was simple. They were well-fed, well-housed, well-paid, and motivated by a clear understanding of what they were working toward. American factory workers had not experienced occupation or devastation. Their cities were not being targeted. Their families were safe. They could focus entirely on production without the distractions of survival that plagued workers in conflict zones. The conversation shifted to the future. Dimitrov asked what would happen to Bulgaria after the conflict ended. Morrison admitted he did not know the specific plans, but he assured Dimitrov that Allied policy aimed at reconstruction rather than punishment. The goal was to build stable, peaceful nations that would not pose future threats. This required investment, infrastructure development, and economic integration. It was a radically different approach from what Dimitrov had expected, based on propaganda he had been exposed to during years of alignment with Germany. The conversation was interrupted by renewed activity, and the two officers parted ways. Dimitrov never saw Morrison again, but the words stayed with him, a concise summary of the lesson the American boots had taught. As winter turned to spring, and the conflict in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the captured American boots became something of a legend in the Bulgarian army. Soldiers who had received them told stories about how the boots had saved their feet, their mobility, their effectiveness as fighters. The boots became symbols not just of American industrial capacity, but of the tangible difference that proper equipment made in a soldier's life. In April 1945, as German resistance collapsed across Europe, Captain Dimitrov was promoted to major and given command of a battalion. By then, Allied supply lines had been established, and Bulgarian forces were receiving regular equipment shipments from American and British sources. The contrast with previous years was staggering. Food was plentiful, medical supplies were adequate, ammunition was no longer rationed down to individual rounds. And yes, there were boots, thousands of pairs of boots, enough that every soldier could have properly fitting footwear with spares available. Dimitrov kept one of the original captured American boots, the very first pair he had examined back in December 1944. He saved it as a reminder of the moment when his understanding of the conflict had fundamentally shifted. Years later, in his memoirs, he would write that the boot represented the day he learned that wars are not won by the bravest soldiers or the most skilled generals, but by the nation that can produce the most bullets, the most bandages, and yes, the most boots. The story of the Bulgarian boots became a case study in military logistics courses after the conflict ended. Analysts used it to illustrate how material superiority could affect not just battlefield outcomes, but also alliance stability and troop morale. The psychological impact of seeing that enemy soldiers were better equipped than friendly forces could not be quantified in traditional military assessments, but it was very real and very powerful. For the individual Bulgarian soldiers who fought through that terrible winter of 1944 to 1945, the American boots were more than just footwear. They were proof that they had been let down by their leadership, that the promises of adequate support from German allies were empty, that their suffering had been unnecessary. The frostbite casualties, the lost toes, the painful marches through snow in inadequate footwear, all of it could have been avoided if Bulgaria had aligned with nations that could actually supply their armies. The broader historical lesson was even more significant. The Second World War was often portrayed as a conflict of ideologies, a clash between different visions of how societies should be organized. But at its most fundamental level, it was a conflict of industrial capacity. The Allied nations could simply make more of everything than the Axis powers, and that material advantage proved decisive. No amount of tactical brilliance or individual heroism could overcome the fact that one side could replace losses while the other could not. The American boots that Bulgarian soldiers captured in December 1944 represented approximately 12 hours of production from a single American factory. 12 hours of work, and Bulgaria's military had enough winter boots to equip a significant portion of an entire army. That simple fact contained within it the entire explanation for why the Axis lost. They were not being defeated by better soldiers or better strategies. They were being buried under an avalanche of production that they had no hope of matching. In the decades after the conflict, historians would debate the various turning points that determined the outcome. Some would point to specific confrontations or strategic decisions. But for men like Georgy Dimitrov, who lived through it and saw the evidence firsthand, the turning point was visible in something as mundane as a pair of boots. When one side could produce in a day what the other produced in a year, the outcome was never really in doubt. Dimitrov retired from the Bulgarian army in 1953 with the rank of colonel. He spent his later years teaching military history at Sofia University, where he often used the story of the American boots as an opening lecture in his courses on logistics. He would bring out that old boot, worn and weathered, but still recognizably superior to anything Bulgaria had produced during the conflict, and he would tell his students that understanding modern warfare meant understanding production capacity, supply chains, and industrial output. He passed away in 1978 at the age of 66. In his personal effects, carefully preserved, was that single American boot and his diary from the winter of 1944. Both are now part of the collection at the Bulgarian National Military Museum in Sofia, silent testimonies to a moment when the truth about the conflict became undeniable. The soldiers who suffered through that winter with inadequate footwear, who lost toes to frostbite, who wrapped their feet in rags and kept marching because they had no other choice, they deserved better. They deserved to be supplied by a nation that had the industrial capacity to actually support its military. Instead, they learned through painful experience that their suffering was a symptom of a much larger failure, a strategic miscalculation that had placed them on the losing side of history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.